We are here to frighten and disturb. Listen at your own discretion.
You must be either mad or insane to seek out this godforsaken place. But since you're here, I guess I can show you the nest of horrors. Don't fall in.
Today's tale, entitled The Burmese Incident, has been crafted together by T.W. Grimm and is being narrated by EurasianRob, Liam Houle, Ranger H. Fox, and Eduardo Riedel.
Here you are, old friend. One more glass of claret each, and we've drained the bottle dry. Imagine, will you, what might have happened if the phylloxera had succeeded in destroying the Bordeaux vineyards entirely. I may have spent far fewer mornings in the grip of a sourgut hangover, that's what. The hour hand on the grandfather clock has slipped past 1, I see. Time for one more tale, and then, I'm afraid, I must retire. I'm not a young man anymore, and neither are you, sir. I can hear our beds calling to us. As a betting man, I'd wager your driver is probably sleeping quite soundly behind the wheel of the Bentley as we speak. The drunken old kraut. Truth be told, I'm really quite envious of those who sleep soundly. Without the drink, I rather doubt I'd ever sleep at all. When I close my eyes, memories have a tendency to invade my dreams and corrupt them into the most horrid nightmares. Speaking of which, tell me something. Have you ever traveled to the Southeast Asian nation of Myanmar? I have, although it was many years ago. At that time, it was still known as Burma. It was a journey I shall never, ever forget. You see, after the end of the Second Great War, my father took an interest in the possibility of acquiring land in Burma, with the intent of developing it for industry. My father, like most industrialists, was a man who was quite short on empathy. The canny old buzzard knew that Southeast Asia had been beaten into submission by the ravages of war. Father was also a betting man, and he was wagering that certain entities in Burma would gladly welcome the strength and status that could only be acquired by obtaining a steady flow of foreign currency. In the wake of the devastation which was brought upon the land by Nazi and Allied forces alike, the entirety of Asia was ripe for the industry of manufacturing, and Burma, in particular, had received a terrible battering during the fighting between the Allies and the Japanese. When the people who had been displaced by the conflict were finally able to return to their homes, they often found their landscape and surrounding countryside had become nothing more than crusted patches of black, tortured earth, pocked by the craters of artillery bombardment. With their livelihood pummeled into non-existence by several years of constant warfare, the people found themselves in dire need of a new way to earn a living. As soon as the dust had safely settled in the wake of the war, a number of industrialists and investment groups began to embark upon diplomatic visits into the region. They were eager for the chance to set up shop and offer the peasants the dubious opportunity to earn a pittance in return for hard labor in their factories. The old man was well aware of the opportunities that might lie within such an economically depressed situation, but he cautiously waited to observe how this venture might unfold out for his peers and rivals. He was uncharitable and hard of heart, my father, but he was certainly no fool. The transition from self-sustaining agriculture to assembly line servitude was a difficult one. Despite the decades of uncertainty and strife they'd made to suffer throughout the war, the Burmans remained a proud and quietly defiant people. They were vocal in their complaints and were prone to civil disobedience. In the meantime, money was being made hand over fist in Japan, India, and Bangladesh, and without the resistance and bother. My father decided to purchase mining options in India instead, and he bided his time. Finally, that event which he deemed inevitable finally occurred. A military coup was staged in Burma, and Prime Minister Nu was imprisoned by his usurpers. The concept of personal freedom soon became a wilted, washed-out memory, replaced with an oppressive nationalism of the sort that is usually enforced by the threat of imprisonment, torture, and death. Before long, it became clear that Burma's new dictatorship was not as keen about serving the people's needs as they'd been led to believe. Political sanctions left the country in a state of financial vulnerability. They were in dire need of friends with deep pockets, and my father possessed very, very deep pockets. However, something the old goat was short on was time. My father was an exceedingly busy man. As I was his oldest son, I was often elected to represent him in business matters that would have seen him travelling abroad. He was loath to embark upon any journey that would result in being surrounded by more brown faces than white. Indeed, my family's patriarch was a ruthless, clever, iron-willed horse's arse of a human being, criminally prejudiced in both thought and deed. He saw no wrong in his actions, because the concept of right and wrong simply did not exist for the man. If he could see a way in which his fortunes might be expanded, the only question was whether or not he could succeed in this enterprise. He didn't give the slightest damn at all for the well-being of others. And I can assure you, this is a depressingly common trait in men of his financial stature. Of course, as wealthy as we both are, it would be impossible to lay claim to a clear conscience. I have made many callous decisions to generate vast profits for myself, whilst knowing full well the result of these decisions might ultimately lay waste to the lives of many others. I have done this, and so have you. Don't deny it. However, there is a fundamental difference between men such as ourselves and men like my father. If you were handed a loaded shotgun and were offered a large sum of money to pull the trigger on me, your oldest and dearest friend, I am sure that you would outright refuse to do so. I am of the same bent. However outrageously high the amount might be, I would be morally unable to carry through with the act. Now, the old man, it would merely be a question of mathematics. Could he buy his way out of any potential consequences? And if so, how much of the proffered money would be left after the expenses of his legal defense? If he deemed the sum large enough to be worth the risk, I'd surely end my existence as a fine spray of red on the wall behind my chair, and be damned if I was his son and heir. Do you know what is truly frightening? People who have been cut from the same moral cloth as my father. They own the entire world, my good man. They own it, and everything that dares to reside upon its surface. But I'm wandering off topic, aren't I? I was telling you about the Burmese incident. So, it came to pass that in June of 1964, my father called me into his office to inform me that I was to pack my bags and travel to Burma post-haste. He assigned me the task of wooing the appropriate officials into allowing our estate to acquire and zone quantities of land for industrial use. After several days of grueling travel, I arrived at my destination, only to find that post-war Myanmar was in an abysmal state of oppression and destitution. Many former landowners had been reduced to a state of ragged, nomadic begging. It was the most squalid situation that I have ever personally witnessed, and I have been to many dark places, old friend. Many. I entered the country through Manipur, leaving Imphal early in the morning. I was driven in a rattling heap of a truck by an ancient-looking and taciturn Indian man. Throughout the entire voyage, he spoke not a single word to me, and he smoked an astonishing amount of hashish in a hand-carved wooden pipe. With a look of amused disdain, he would periodically push this sticky object into my hands, and I gratefully inhaled to stave off my discomfort and boredom. The hashish was layered with veins of the most potent opium I have ever encountered. I don't think I could really tell you much of what took place on that long drive from Manipur to Mandalay, save that, despite the poor quality of the roads, I felt as if I were floating upon the back of God's own sacred stallion. I was probably grinning like a fool for the duration of the journey. However, I wasn't so stoned that I don't remember how we frequently were stopped at various checkpoints, to be held at gunpoint and barked at by Burman men in tattered military uniform. My driver would hand them a few bills from the stack of rupees which had been demanded of me by the old Indian's nephew, back in Imphal City, and then we would be waved along. I was probably very close to death at any number of these checkpoint stops, but I could not sense this danger through the dreamy haze the narcotics had draped over my senses. This, I imagine, was probably for the best. And then, as if rudely awakened from a golden dream, I suddenly found myself in the pulsing heart of Mandalay. The truck was no longer moving, and I was being pulled unceremoniously from my seat by my driver, who appeared to have become quite irate with my unresponsive state of drugged stupor. He eloquently cursed my very existence and tossed me to the ground. My luggage quickly followed. I heard a cacophony of angry shouting, and a small group of Burman men set upon the driver before he could flee into the safety of his truck. They dragged him to the other side of the road and proceeded to administer a sound beating. As the weeping man was being kicked, slapped, and ultimately thrown into the muck that flowed along the bottom of the gutter, another Burman man knelt beside me and helped me to my feet. He said,
"I am so sorry for this outrage, sir. My deepest apologies. He is being dealt with accordingly, as you can see. This man is an addict and a scoundrel, hardly better than a dog. But he has his uses."
While almost everyone else were clothed in traditional Burman sarongs, my distinguished new acquaintance was wearing a Western-style suit and sported a Western hairstyle. He steadied me with one hand as he brushed me off, and then clasped my hand in a firm handshake. He said,
My name is Bong Kong Chi. You can simply call me Kong Chi, if you wish. Welcome to Burma, sir. I fear you look rather tired. But I'm afraid we must be leaving for our destination at once. There is an urgent matter there which demands my attention immediately.
Bo Kong Chi escorted me down the street to a waiting limousine. I was still quite groggy from the opium-laced hashish, and the commotion of life in Mandalay was almost overwhelming. Everywhere I looked, there were restless throngs of humanity bustling to and fro. Thousands of people engaged in thousands of errands. Despite the economic hardships that were soon to come, there was still a multitude of vendors selling spices, linens, livestock, any product or service you could possibly imagine. There were performers and prostitutes, laborers and housewives, holy men, beggars, every ethnicity and nationality that exists beneath the sun. Motor vehicles rolled down the street behind donkey carts that were piled to precarious heights with goods of every description. If one were either brave or foolish enough to wander through the alleys, they would find layabouts, thieves, and cutthroats from all corners of creation. Any face that passed by on the street could belong to a member of the secret police. It was an unstable time, and just about anyone could be an informant, a double agent, or just another murderer for hire. Even in the company of my new business acquaintance and savior, I could easily say the wrong thing and find myself in mortal peril. The prefix Bo is an honorific in Burmese culture, which translates to something like commander or general. I would be far from safe within the confines of the luxury limousine. In fact, to get inside with a commanding officer of the present military regime would be akin to crawling into the belly of the beast. Once inside, I may never be seen again. Once we were safely ensconced within the sumptuous comforts of the limousine, Kong Chi commanded the driver to take us to what he referred to as Facility A. As the driver navigated the enormous vehicle through the crowded streets, I was informed that the new regime's official stance was to favor agrarian peasant culture over Western-style industrialization. However, they were secretly quite interested in the mass production of arms, ammunition, and armored vehicles with a military purpose. According to my host, my father had already purchased land and built a facility for the development and construction of a lightweight metal alloy, a miracle metal that was stronger than steel. I had no idea that any such arrangement was already in place. Kong Chi saw the confusion on my face and handed me an envelope. He said,
This will answer all of your questions.
And pushed the envelope into my hands. I wasn't surprised to see it had already been opened, presumably by Bo Kong Chi himself. There was a letter from my father inside. It had been dated and mailed almost a week before my hasty departure. I believe I still have it somewhere. Ah, yes, in this old chest. Just a minute. Ah, yes. Here it is. See here. The selfish old goat had written.
I'm afraid I did not tell you the full story behind the reason for your visit to the region of Mandalay. I confess that I have already financed a manufacturing facility in the area, with another soon to be under construction. I have been receiving conflicting, and I dare say sensationalistic reports of extremely violent civil unrest occurring in the nearby village. It has been suggested by some of my scientific advisors that some byproduct of the manufacturing process may be responsible. With this in mind, I need someone who is a trusted member of the family, a capable man in his own right, and also my very own flesh and blood. This is a very sensitive matter. You must dig to the bottom of this mess and report back to me at once. My apologies for committing the sin of omission, but frankly, I believe you may very well have refused to go if I'd been forthcoming with all the details. By all reports, you are walking into a very volatile situation. Trust Bo Quang-Chi, and no one else. He no longer has faith in the current regime and is now in my employ. He will act as both your guide and your bodyguard throughout the duration of your investigation. He too is a capable man. If the situation becomes too much to handle, he will ensure your prompt and secure exit. Rest assured. Serve us well, my son, and take care to make sure this embarrassment reaches neither the ears of our enemies nor the media. Our very livelihoods may depend on it. Yours truly, Father.
As you can see, the absolute scoundrel couldn't even be bothered to sign off with his given name. Just, yours truly, Father, and nothing more. I glared over at the stranger to whom I was expected to entrust my very life, and I roared. What in bloody fucking blazes is happening here? I demand to know at once. He chuckled dryly at my outburst and said,
It would be better if I were to show you, sir. You won't believe it until you've seen it for yourself.
We drove in silence for the better part of an hour, long enough for me to sober up and regain my wits. The facility was located near the bank of a river southeast of Mandalay. It was surrounded by an enormous stone wall, which was topped by hundreds of spools of razor wire. We were let through a massive iron-wrought gate by armed security, and we drove for nearly a quarter of a mile along a dirt laneway until the main building rose into view. We passed 2 more checkpoints on the way, each accompanied by a perimeter of electrified fencing. I was both impressed with and deeply troubled by the stringency of their security. I gestured at the fencing and demanded, Pray tell, sir, what in God's name goes on in this place that would require such measures? Quang-Chi offered an enigmatic smile. He said,
These precautions are relatively new developments. Be patient for just a few more minutes, and then it'll become very, very clear to you.
The limousine stopped at the rear of the main building, and I was hustled through a fire exit and down a long, sterile-looking corridor. Quang-Chi stopped in front of a sturdy-looking metal door, which was being guarded by 2 armed soldiers, and he said,
Take this, sir. Embrace yourself for what you're about to witness.
He pulled a .38 pistol from a hidden pocket in his jacket and pushed it into my hand. His expression was drawn and tense. It was clear that he was very afraid of whatever waited for us on the other side of the door. The tough old career officer steadied himself and uttered a quick prayer before pulling back several large deadbolts. After taking in a very deep breath, he nodded to me and threw open the door. A horrid stench of putrefaction rushed out to assail my nostrils, causing me to gag in revulsion. Quang-Chi pressed his handkerchief over his face, as did I, and we crossed the threshold into the very bowels of hell. The interior of the room was made of highly polished concrete. There were several drains on the floor, and a number of new water hose reels were affixed to the walls. There were 8 man-sized cages bolted to the floor, and 3 of them were occupied by the most ghastly-looking wretches I'd ever laid eyes on. They all wore the filthy clothing and possessed the grey, mottled appearance of a corpse. They began to hurl themselves against the bars of their respective cages as we entered the room. They made no sound at all, these creatures. They simply stared at us with a fierce expression of open-mouthed idiocy, and they battered themselves with great force against the steel bars of their prisons. All 3 of them were caked in dried gore, adding to the already abominable odor in the room. "God in heaven!" I choked. "What in the name of Jehovah is wrong with these people?" Kong Chi gave me an appraising look and said,
They're dead, sir. They have no pulse, brain activity, or automatic reflexes. They are actively decaying before our very eyes.
I growled, "Balderdash! They could not possibly be deceased. They're moving under their own power." Bo Kong Chi uttered a cynical laugh and snapped,
I have seen many dead men in my days on this planet, sir. Seen 'em and made 'em. And I tell you, these people are dead. Dead as can be.
I was both horrified and completely transfixed by the mindless violence with which they threw themselves against the bars. "What do they want from us?" I asked. "It seems they would very much like to attack us."
They want to eat us alive.
Kong Chi said, and he nodded at the shocked expression on my face.
Oh yes, I'm telling you the truth. If they could, they would leap upon us like starving leopards and bite chunks of living flesh from our bodies. This one here, do you see the blood around his mouth?
He explained the awful thing had been discovered in the act of devouring a small child in a field just outside Wide River, a village located not far from the grounds of the facility. They'd been forced to evacuate the village after this last attack, the latest in a series of more than 20 such incidents in the 3 weeks preceding my arrival. They could no longer keep the situation a secret without removing and isolating the villagers. I choked out, "I've seen enough. Let me out." When the door was safely locked up tight behind us, Kong Chi continued my debriefing. He said,
I apologize for that, but I felt you may need to see the effects of this disaster for yourself before I could tell you the full story. May I have my firearm back?
The company had been storing some of the waste products of the process in an underground storage bunker. Some bungling fool decided to dig this bunker upslope from the village, and several barrels of some toxic compound leaked into the bare, earthen floor. During a rainstorm, of course. Several weeks later, the body of a recently deceased farmer staggered into the village, covered from head to toe in the muck of the grave. It immediately attacked several people, tearing at them with its teeth as they screamed in horror. A brave villager dealt it a number of grievous blows with an axe, but it continued to come for him, until the villager planted the head of his axe deep into the horrible thing's skull. All those who were bitten during the farmer's cannibalistic frenzy died within the hour, only to rise again with blank eyes and savage teeth. 10 more were injured that night, and 1 woman was killed outright during the attack. A witness stated that, as her last breath gurgled from her open wounds, the fiend immediately lost interest and pursued the witness instead. The dead woman rose from the ground within 60 seconds, lurching outside to add to the bloodshed and terror in the streets of the village. The infection spread like wildfire, resulting in a rapid state of utter chaos. A military unit stationed nearby came in armored vehicles and made short work of the marauding creatures. All the wounded were taken for observation and were ultimately destroyed before the hand struck the midnight hour. A soldier was bitten on the hand by one of the afflicted, and he was also transformed, injuring several others before the whole lot of them were unceremoniously turned into mincemeat under the blazing gun of the commanding officer. After this initial wave of infection, there were no further incidents until almost a week later, when an old woman succumbed to a natural death in her slumber. She came out of her hut and attacked a passing villager, sparking off another round of shootings by the soldiers who'd been left behind to monitor the village and its inhabitants. It became clear that anyone living within the village and the surrounding countryside had already been thoroughly contaminated by the offending toxin, and death from any cause was sure to spark another outbreak. He finished his morbid summary by saying the infected would chase after anything that lives, no matter its species or even its size. Their bite would sicken and kill virtually any animal, although these creatures would not return after death. Thank God for that, my good man. Thank God, and a toast to his small mercies. Needless to say, I was appalled beyond words. I shook my finger and sputtered, "Why don't you put them out of their misery, for God's sake? What purpose is there in keeping them in that room for even one more second?" Kong Chi explained the dreadful things were of great scientific interest to the regime. He laughed and added,
Do you really believe your own government would dispose of such a curious anomaly, sir? I think not. They'll do exactly what we are doing, as would any nation.
I rounded on him and sputtered, "My God, man, have you lost your mind? By the power invested in me by my father, I declare this facility will be shut down immediately. The construction of the other plants shall also be halted. How has this not already happened, for Christ's sake?" Bo Kong Chi offered me a razor-sharp smile and said,
You do not understand, sir. It was your own father who refused to shut down operations. He insisted that he was first to be allowed to send an emissary to assess the situation, and then give him a first-hand report on the matter.
I was dismayed, but not at all surprised. My father loved money before all else in this world. He would sacrifice his own flesh and blood before he would spurn even one singular day's worth of revenue from one of his numerous ventures. I demanded access to a telephone and called my father at once. He expressed grave consternation at my report, and he reluctantly agreed to shut the facility down until his scientists for hire were able to gain some insight into this grisly phenomenon. I announced that I would be leaving first thing in the morning, and flatly declined father's insistent requests that I stay until the matter had been further explored and resolved to my satisfaction. I was almost as sickened by his greed as I was by the caged monstrosities that lay behind the steel door. I dare say they were, for all intents and purposes, one and the same. I was taken to an area filled with canvas tents, an outdoor ghetto to house the laborers who worked on the factory floor. I was given a tent, furnished with a cot and nothing more, and I purchased food and drink from a peasant woman who patrolled the impromptu campgrounds with a hand-woven basket filled with refreshments. I spent the evening speaking at length with Bo Kong Chi concerning the finer details of the plant's imminent closure. He was afraid the workers would riot if they were told to summarily pack their belongings and go home. I assured him I would finance their wages out of my own pocket in the weeks to come, if it came to that. I was determined to keep everyone exactly where they were until more was known about the toxic byproducts and their effects on both the living and the deceased. If the workers had become contaminated by drinking groundwater from their communal well, they couldn't possibly be allowed to leave the premises. Such a foolish decision would surely start a horrific chain reaction, one that could lay waste to the entire country, and even beyond, I'd imagine. Far beyond. Throughout our negotiations, I noticed Kong Chi was subtly attempting to sway me into allowing the plant to continue production, extolling the virtues of their miracle metal and its many benign applications. He expressed concern regarding the possibility of scandalizing the regime on the world stage. I stoically ignored his requests and implied threats, but on the inside, I was sweating bullets. I could see the writing on the wall, and it boded poorly for my own well-being. I wished Kong Chi a good night, and spent long hours lying awake in my cot, waiting for the residents of the squalid encampment to settle down and retire to their beds. I feared Bo Kong Chi was not actually my bodyguard and advisor, so much as he was my jailer, and eventually, my executioner. He may have been in my father's pocket, but his allegiance lay with his superiors in the regime. He would not allow production to cease, nor would he allow me to leave the country to possibly tell the world that his benign regime was in the business of oppression. Sooner or later, Kong Chi would kill me, and my own father would undoubtedly shrug off my murder as collateral damage. At 3 a.m, I slipped from my tent and walked back to the first checkpoint, leaving everything behind, save for a duffel bag packed with essential items. I gruffly demanded the scared young men in the soldiers' uniforms allow me to pass, and I was convincing enough in my feigned authority that I was ushered through the gate. It was the same at the next gate, but the soldiers waiting for me at the main entrance had their rifles cocked and at the ready. I was detained and made to wait until Bo Kong Chi arrived, his hair tousled from sleep and a tight expression of carefully controlled rage on his face. He said,
"You're not stupid, and neither am I, sir. I suspected you would try to sneak away in the dead of night. I cannot let you do that."
He put a pistol on my back and started marching me up the road on foot. We had just reached the first inner gate when a high-pitched siren began wailing in the main building, making everyone in earshot jump in unison. I felt my blood freeze in my veins. I had a pretty good idea what that siren might be warning us against. The infection was no longer contained. Bo Kong Chi barked some orders at the soldiers in their native tongue. They scrambled into tactical positions as another officer ran to fetch the radio. Kong Chi shoved me back in the direction of the main entrance and snarled,
"Wait for me at the front gate! Go!"
I ran back and put my hands up, screaming at the guards to hold their fire. From a distance, I could hear a growing cacophony of screams and gunshots. The infection had ripped through the workers on the evening shift and spread to the tent city. I could see staccato bursts of orange and white as gunfire lit up the night beyond the second security fence. The guards standing beside me at the main gate were listening to the panicked voices on their radio with an identical look of glassy-eyed horror. One of them turned to me and gasped,
"The camp is gone! They've been forced to retreat.
The gunfire continued, as did the screams of despair and agony. The growing wave of the dead overwhelmed the first line of defense and came running to the second gate. I quailed at the sight of the quiet horde beneath the emergency floodlights, now several hundred strong and surging along like a tidal wave. They made no sound as they fell beneath a hail of bullets, unfeeling and uncaring. They clashed into the fence, and it immediately began to buckle before the sheer mass of the bodies pressing into the other side. Someone shouted an order, and the soldiers promptly stopped firing, turning to flee mere seconds before the fence gave out and toppled flat onto the ground. I seized one of the guards by the shirt and bellowed,
They're coming! Open this goddamn gate, you bloody fool! Run for your life!
I shoved the terrified young man into the control booth. He released the locking mechanism, and we all ran through the gate like the wind. All of us sprinting for our lives in opposite directions. Somewhere behind us, the survivors were scrambling to get away from their pursuers. A ravenous horde of silent shadows in the darkness. I ran to the top of a steep incline overlooking the factory and stopped to catch my breath. From my vantage point, I observed that one lone figure reached the gate slightly ahead of the rest of them, only to dash into the control booth and initiate the closing sequence. He scrambled through the rapidly narrowing gap with only a bare instant to spare. Seconds later, there were a multitude of shrill cries from the other side, followed by another burst of gunfire. This was followed by a great volley of hysterical screaming, and when it was over, the only sound was dead hands battering against the steel bars of the gate. I shall never forget those despairing cries, my friend. Not if I live to be 200 years old. They still haunt my nightmares. I had little doubt this horrible treachery had been carried out by Bo Kong Chi. He coldly sacrificed the survivors in order to keep the infected contained within the fortified walls. I watched as he examined the ground in the moonlight, looking for footprints in the dirt, and I knew I would have to kill him with great haste, or I would never leave Burma in one piece. Although the administration undoubtedly knew of my presence, only Kong Chi could verify that I was still alive. The regime would have to dispatch all the ghouls and sift through their bodies in order to determine if my lifeless corpse was amongst their ranks. I intended to be long gone across the Indian border before this happened. But Bo Kong Chi needed to die first, and quickly, before reinforcements arrived. I snuck down the hill and crouched behind an outcropping of jagged rocks, watching my nemesis as he followed my blundering tracks across the scrubland with a flashlight in one hand and his pistol in the other. I scooped up a handful of large pebbles and trickled them down the precipice below, alerting him to my location. Kong Chi went as still as a statue. He stared in my direction for a moment, then turned off his flashlight and resumed his stealthy stalking in the moonlight. He called out,
You will never get across the border, you fool! You won't make it 10 miles before you're captured by the patrol. It would be better for you to come out now and peacefully surrender. I promise, no harm will come to you.
I knew his assurances were lies. Men like Kong Chi tell lies for a living, after all. I waited until he was near the foot of the rocky slope, and then I popped up from my hiding place to hurl down a large rock upon his head. It missed and struck him in the shoulder, knocking him to the ground with a strangled cry of pain. He rolled onto his back and blindly fired his weapon above him, forcing me to duck for cover as bullets ricocheted off the rocks in all directions.
You dog!
He cried out.
Treacherous fucking dog!
Treachery!
I called back.
You would know all about treachery, wouldn't you, sir?
I made my way to the bottom of the slope and stood over him with another large stone clasped in my hands. Bo Kong Chi had been grievously injured by the falling rock. His shoulder was hunched at an odd angle, and the arm attached to it lay uselessly beside him. He bared his teeth at me in a grimace of rage and pulled a knife from a sheath on his belt.
I'll gut you!
He snarled and attempted to slash my legs. I skipped back from harm's way and hurled the heavy stone with all my might. It bounced off his chest with tremendous force. He dropped his knife and spasmed on the ground in agony.
Fucking dog!
He wheezed.
Kill you!
I wrested one final chunk of stone from the ground, and I told him,
You'll never harm another living being, you soulless bastard!
I lifted the rock high and dropped it on his head, cutting off his scream with a sickening crunch. I'd never killed a man before, and I was surprised with how little I felt at his passing. I watched Kong Chi's body carefully for a minute or two, his pistol clenched in my hand, but he did not come back from the dead. Either he'd managed to avoid contamination from the noxious chemical byproduct, or I'd destroyed his brain to the point where resurrection was no longer possible. I'll never know for sure, but I can say with confidence that I was a trifle disappointed I did not get a chance to dispatch that horrible man a second time. I'm not ashamed to admit it would have brought me great satisfaction to kill him once again. I robbed his lifeless body of all weapons, ammunition, money, and anything else I deemed to be useful, and I headed west under the pale light of the moon. I won't bore you with the details of my escape from Burma, as this tale has certainly dragged on long enough. All I will say is that several more men died by my hand before I crossed into Bangladesh. Regrettable, perhaps, but I am alive and present to tell the tale. A toast, sir, to my continuing survival in this world of perfidious schemes and damning betrayals. A toast to us all. What was my father's reaction, you ask? He was furious, of course. He threatened to disown me for, in his own words, bungling the deal. I informed him I would gladly sacrifice my inheritance for the privilege of telling him to go to hell. And I reminded him that I owned a large stake in many of our family ventures. He never spoke to me again, the horrible old bastard. It was a state of affairs I found to be most agreeable. When he passed on, I sold my shares to my siblings, and I took an early retirement from the world of big business, with at least a portion of my soul still intact. And with that, sir, my tale has reached its conclusion. I don't expect you to believe a single word of it, but I don't expect you to disbelieve either. There are many wondrous and horrible things in the world, both in it and beyond. I have spent many years in pursuit of the arcane, and I can tell you, with great confidence, that much strangeness lurks in the shadows of the five senses. Smile and shake your head if you will, but the unwary often find themselves in fantastic situations. Mark my words, good sir. It happens all the time. Good night, old friend, and take care. We'll share a bottle and an evening of macabre tales again very soon. I look forward to it.
Consider reviewing us on iTunes and Stitcher, and following us on social media at Nest of Horrors. Thank you for listening.